There are moments that seem ordinary until you realize they are the kinds of nights that set hidden truths aflame. And I remember the way the air held its breath that evening. The way the neighborhood street looked so deceptively familiar. Lampposts glowing in their dull orange halos, tree branches whispering in the humid August air, as if nothing extraordinary could possibly happen there. Yet beneath that familiarity, a quiet storm was waiting. If you've ever felt that unease, that low hum of injustice hiding beneath casual glances and routine stops, then you know exactly where this story is headed. And if you believe every voice deserves to be heard against the grain of silence, then like and subscribe to journeys like this one, because what you're about to hear is not just a story. It is a truth cloaked as fiction, an echo too often ignored. I was there that evening, or at least it felt like I was, watching every detail as though through glass. And I can tell you the quiet came first. The steady rhythm of footsteps, sneakers brushing against cracked cement, the occasional shuffle of a duffel bag slung too heavily across his shoulder, the low hum of music leaking faintly from headphones resting around his neck. His name, though the officers didn't bother to ask at first, was Daryl Jackson, taller than most, broad-shouldered but burdened in a way physical strength could not hide. He walked down the neighborhood block not as an intruder, not as a threat, but as someone returning home, sweat darkening the gray fabric of his hoodie after what I knew to be a long evening at the gym. Nothing about him screamed menace. Nothing painted him guilty. And yet that was the irony of the night. Accusation often arrives disguised as vigilance. It was the sudden gleam of headlights behind him that broke through, creeping closer, then slowing, until the familiar crown of flashing red and blue lights ignited across the asphalt, scattering shadows against brick facades and slumbering porches. People pretend those lights mean safety, but to some, they are alarms, signals that danger has found you regardless of your innocence. I watched him pause, not startled so much as resigned, like a man already knowing the script even before the words were delivered. The patrol car door opened with a creak too sharp for the quiet of the evening, and two figures emerged, not aggressively, not yet, but with that unspoken authority that pressed heavy against every movement, every syllable. "Sir, can you stop for a moment?" the first officer called, his voice casual enough to mask the weight beneath it, though his eyes were scanning, measuring Daryl as though his very existence were a puzzle to solve. The second officer flanked slightly behind, hands casually low but near the belt, where so many assumptions tend to rest. Daryl turned, still clutching his duffel strap, his face unreadable but not impolite, as though somewhere inside he was weighing the fine balance between silence and explanation. Around them, the neighborhood wasn't empty. A pair of teenagers outside a coffee shop leaned against the glass, half watching. A woman pulling her trash bins to the curb hesitated, her hand on the rusted lid as she lingered longer than necessary. Even the shadows seemed to be wider-eyed. "We got a report of someone in the area," the officer continued, fitting your description. "Acting suspicious." Suspicious. That word dangled like bait in stale air, too vague to mean anything but too loaded to ignore. Sweat still clung to Daryl's brow, not just from the gym but from the sudden spotlight of scrutiny, and yet his voice was steady when he spoke. "I'm just walking home, officer. Nothing else." The explanation seemed barely acknowledged, his words brushed aside as the questions began piling. Where exactly was he coming from? Where exactly was he going? Did he live around here? The way their tones sharpened with each query, you could almost believe walking with a bag after dark was crime enough. The duffel, in its ordinariness, drew their focus. One officer shifted slightly closer, as if its weight carried something more than clothes and a towel. "What's in the bag?" came the inevitable question, and Daryl's hands, still visible, tightened on the strap, not in defiance, but as a man clinging to patience. Every eye nearby was caught on the unfolding scene as though looking away might be a betrayal. The coffee shop teens muttering quietly, the woman with the bins finally frozen mid-step, watching as though she understood too well the tension of being examined without reason. And me? I was there in that moment, if not in body then in every sense memory. The sinking feeling in the stomach, the low buzz of adrenaline that urges you to protest, but simultaneously warns you that protest could, in itself, be weaponized against you. Daryl raised his head. His gaze was not confrontational, but it carried a dignity the officers seemed almost irritated by. "Officer," he said slowly, carefully, "I live 3 blocks that way, up near the library." But his voice, however calm, was being sifted through a filter. Suspicion first, understanding only as afterthought. "We'll need to see some ID," came the reply, and though it was phrased as request, the tone made it command. And so the scene unfolded under street lamps that hummed like insects, under a night sky that bore silent witness as a man walked home in sweatpants and a hoodie, yet found himself transformed into a suspect through nothing more than circumstance and skin. That was the first act of the night, a pause before revelation, a silence before truth broke the surface. Yet in those moments before anything was proven, what lingered louder than the officer's words were the thoughts of every witness. Unspoken questions rippling through them. How many times has this same scene played before, and at what cost? Because what they didn't know, and what they were yet to learn, was that Daryl Jackson was not just any man with tired eyes and a duffel bag. He was a soldier marked by history, a veteran whose scars were woven into the fabric of the streets they patrolled, a man carrying not only gym clothes, but a story stitched in sacrifice. The stillness of the night fractured with each question they hurled toward him, as if their voices, sharp and precise, were chisels attempting to carve him into a shape that made sense in their eyes. And I remember how the air thickened between them, charged like static before a storm. Daryl stood there, broad shoulders steady, but the tautness in his jaw betrayed the restraint beneath his calm demeanor, the kind of patience only someone who has been tested too many times before can summon, as though he knew every second of silence could be mistaken for defiance, yet every word could be used against him. "Where did you say you were coming from again?" the taller officer pressed, his pen already scratching against a small pad as if documenting an offense long before one was proven. Daryl repeated himself, his responses clipped but measured. The gym, his home just a few blocks away, the ordinance of routine life. Yet routine meant nothing here, because they weren't searching for truth so much as justification. The way one officer's gaze kept sinking toward the duffel bag. It was inevitable. Their skepticism fixated on it like hawks hovering over prey, their suspicion searching for ammunition. "Open it," the second officer said, not loudly, but firmly, the kind of command that echoed even without a raised voice. Daryl shifted his weight, the strap digging into the muscular angle of his shoulder, and for a fleeting second I felt his hesitation, not the fear of what would be found, because the bag held nothing more than the damp clothes and towel from his workout, but the hesitation born from knowing that every gesture, every zipper pull, every move of his hands was already under a microscope of prejudice. Slowly, the officer added, which struck me as both absurd and cruel, the way suspicion reimagines harmless motions as potential threats. Daryl crouched, kneeling slightly, unzipping the bag with deliberate slowness, each rasp of the zipper loud against the close hush of the night, and from within he withdrew precisely what he'd said: rolled up clothes, an empty water bottle, the mundane trappings of a man winding down the day. Still, the officers weren't finished. "Any ID on you?" one asked, and the scene tilted. You could feel it, the shifting of ground beneath something that until then had been so one-sided. Daryl straightened, sweat catching on his temple in the lamplight, and slid one hand carefully to his back pocket, his tone even as he spoke. "Yes, officer." The pause hung heavy. It was not what he carried in that wallet, but how he carried it. Deliberately, cautiously, 2 fingers and thumb lifting the leather fold as though displaying contraband, though it was nothing but his life reduced to cards. He pulled free the first, a driver's license, state-issued, his current address proving the very point of his story. But then, as though by decision rather than accident, he slipped out another card, weathered at the edges, encased in the faint sheen of years gone by, its insignia glinting faintly even under the dull sodium glow of the streetlights. The taller officer took it and frowned, eyes dilating slightly not in suspicion but in surprise. You could see the recognition carving cracks across his carefully neutral mask. The card wasn't ordinary. It carried the seal, the numbering, the etched marks of service. Army Ranger, tours completed, honors annotated. "You're military?" the officer asked, though the question was redundant. The answer cut already into the lamination itself, the symbols weightier than words. Daryl's gaze didn't waver. 22 years, he said, his voice low but resolute. And though nothing about his stance changed, something in the air did. It was as if he had thrown back a curtain that they hadn't realized was there, revealing themselves as actors in a play they didn't control anymore. Afghanistan, Iraq, Ranger Battalion. Silence bloomed. The shorter officer leaned closer, blinking at the card now passed into his hand. It was not only the authenticity they were processing, but the realization that the man they had ringed in suspicion had lived and bled in service of the very flags stitched onto their uniforms. Around them, I saw the small ripples this revelation sparked. The coffee shop teens edging closer to the window glass, whispers spreading between them, the woman with the trash bin lowering it slowly back to the sidewalk, her face frozen between shame and awe. We didn't know, the taller officer began, his tone faltering, authority cracking ever so slightly. But Daryl's answer was silence, and that silence was louder than any defense he could have spoken. It said, "You didn't ask, you didn't care to know, you assumed before you knew me." It said everything his restraint had been holding back. The weight shifted, the power imbalance wobbling, and yet the unease didn't dissipate, because apology could not repair what suspicion had already carved into that night. The officer offered the cards back, slowly, his hand extended, but Daryl didn't move at first. He let the moment stew, let every onlooker taste the discomfort that came from realizing righteousness doesn't erase the shadow of prejudice. It only exposes it under brighter light. And in his eyes, I could see the story extending larger than him. The memory of others who weren't given this pause before proof, who weren't recognized in time, whose service or humanity just wasn't seen quickly enough. He took his cards finally, sliding them back into his wallet with a deliberate patience, his gaze never breaking from theirs. And though his lips didn't move, the exhaustion in his eyes translated a silent truth even the officers could read. He shouldn't have to serve a country twice, once on the battlefield, and once again on his own streets, to be believed. That was the heart of the interrogation, its cruelest irony, not what they found in his bag, but what they had failed to see in him all along. What came next was less about words and more about the silence that wrapped itself around the street, the kind of silence that isn't emptiness but a density, pressing down on everyone who stood in its grip, and I could feel it even from my vantage. Though I existed in the retelling, I felt as if I were right there in that suspended moment when truth has been forced into the open, and those responsible for doubting it don't yet know how to or whether they even can make it right. The taller officer cleared his throat again, his posture softer now, shoulders bending toward apology, though he never actually spoke the word, as if voicing it would not be enough to repair the fracture they had created. The shorter one shifted uncomfortably, the kind of shifting that revealed more about shame than about strategy, looking anywhere but directly at Daryl's unflinching expression. And all the while, he stood there without moving, without relinquishing the power of his stillness, his silence reminding them that by dragging him into this interrogation, they had already said more than any apology could erase. The onlookers felt it too, the teens no longer whispering quips through the glass, but watching openly now with something almost reverent in their expressions, as if they too were caught in the realization that authority is fragile when confronted with the truth of who a person really is. The woman with her trash bin finally let it rest against the curb with a dull scrape, her eyes glistening, her lips pressed tight as though she had dozens of thoughts but couldn't summon any of them into words. "You can go," the officer finally muttered, but the phrase sounded weakened, brittle, a far cry from the commands they had slummed so confidently only minutes before. Daryl took a step forward, slow and deliberate, and in that movement carried a presence sharper than any anger. He was not rushing to leave, not hurrying to escape their scrutiny, but instead walking with the deliberate measure of a man reclaiming space they had tried to deny him. At the corner of his mouth there was no smirk or smile, but the faintest tightening that spoke not of triumph but of resilience, as though he knew too well this encounter was one of many, and that victory in this moment could not undo the countless times someone else had faced a similar night and wasn't given the same chance to reveal their truth. When he passed the squad car, its lights still strobing red and blue across his face, he stopped and turned ever so slightly, his voice quiet but clear enough for the officers, the bystanders, and the night itself to record. You see a hoodie, a duffel, a face you don't know, and you call it suspicious. But nothing about me is a mystery. My service is written in scars, my loyalty stamped on those cards you handled like evidence. I earned the right to walk down this street without suspicion following me, and yet here we are. The words weren't shouted, nor were they crafted like a rehearsed speech, but they cut deeper precisely because they were delivered plain, truths laid bare, presented not to convince but to remind those listening of their own failings. Neither officer interrupted, neither officer defended, because by then they understood the futility of excuses. He adjusted the strap of his duffel, already turning toward the direction of his home, and with each step that carried him away, the silence of the officers grew heavier, as if the longer they said nothing, the more it echoed like an admission of guilt. The bystanders, however, didn't remain silent in their minds. I could feel their thoughts swirling with unease and awakening. The teens exchanging glances that suggested they would retell this story to their friends with a reverence for the man who stood taller than the accusations against him. The woman blinking back something raw in her gaze as she finally recalled her footing and retreated inside, perhaps carrying the weight of what she had just seen into her own home. The air felt different after, thicker and changed. Almost as though the neighborhood itself was aware that history had just etched another entry line in the endless ledger of nights where people like Daryl Jackson had been asked to prove the worth of simply existing. He walked until the lights behind him faded, until the officers were no longer within view. And though their car remained parked, though their eyes may have lingered on his back as he turned the corner, it was he who held the story, he who owned the power of having unmoved dignity in the face of disproportionate doubt. That is what I remember most about the ending. The realization that he never needed their validation, their apologies, or even their shifting guilt. What he carried in that worn-out wallet, in those scars beneath his hoodie, in the even timbre of his voice and the measured way he left without bending to their expectations, was his own proof. Proof of service, yes, but also proof of humanity beyond their suspicions, a kind of proof that spoke to everyone watching silently from the sidelines. You are more than what they see in a glance, and you don't owe the world another battle just to claim your right to breathe free. And though the night tried to settle back into its usual rhythm, the lamps still glowing, the insects still droning, the streets still lined with houses tugged into restfulness, it didn't feel quite like the same neighborhood anymore. It felt altered, branded by memory, scarred by what had been revealed, and somewhere in that shift was the quiet unmasking, not of Daryl the veteran, for that revelation was only part of the truth, but of the system, of the assumptions, of the fragile armor worn by those who believed authority was shield enough to conceal their bias. The night unmasked them all, and though Daryl vanished down the street, leaving only the afterimage of his silhouette beneath the streetlights, his silence remained, echoing in the ears of those who knew they'd witnessed something too raw to dismiss, a story whose resonance would follow them long after the last flicker of the cruiser's lights died out.